there was a story over the weekend. I don't know if you saw it. It was buried actually, but it led the Sunday Star Times on Sunday. Did you see that story about Stats New Zealand investigating? Did you see that?
Oh yes.
Stats New Zealand investigating the potential misuse of Māori census data. Is that always a potential, or is it just more, again, is that because of the way in which the modern census is conducted these days?
Yes, it is unusual. It is unusual, and I think it coincided with a period in which people were being registered for roles. So you'll notice as part of that is there was an incentive to move to the Māori role. In my experience with the census, that is a really unusual situation, and I hope they get to the bottom of it, because the integrity of the census is absolutely critical. I mean, I think there's a big question about whether we're going to continue the census in its, well, I was going to say existing form, but we've talked about that. So yeah, it's a bit of an issue. I didn't see it.
Just to explain to listeners, this on Sunday, I think it was Andrea Vance who was the she was the political editor, I think, has been the political editor for the Stuff for a while now, has broken a story about suggested wrongdoing at a marae in the North Island, particularly in Auckland. We'll talk a little bit longer on. And that was to do with the Te Pāti Māori getting access to confidential census data for the point and purpose of political campaigning, which is, I understand, what the investigation is, and I think there's also been, Paul, a complaint to the police as well. I guess that will be an ongoing story. But if people don't believe that your census data is secure and that it can be obtained, in this particular case by a political party for political purposes, will that also diminish the confidence of New Zealanders to participate in the census in future?
Absolutely. The integrity of the census relies on a relationship between you, or a contract between you and the government, and part of that contract is absolute confidentiality. And of course, the other thing is we've got a very large number of people, over 30% of New Zealanders now are immigrants, and many of them come from countries where governments are treated with a lot of suspicion. And one thing we need to do, once they arrive in New Zealand, is say, no, our government and our processes are absolutely watertight. So any suggestion that they're not watertight is deeply problematic for all sorts of purposes.
Yes, that has the potential to corrupt our, and that is, the word is corrupt, our census in the future. You've just talked about the fact we may not have censuses in the future. I guess this government will have to make that decision in terms of planning for 2028, because that's when the next one's due. But what would you replace it with that would provide you with data that is as accurate?
In my view, nothing. The alternatives are surveys like the Household Labour Force Survey, which had, I think, I know, 16,000 people. There is administrative data, so you and I supply data to the government all the time when we go into hospital, tax returns and so on, and you could get data from that, and obviously the 2023 census has had to be made up with some of that data. But for me, the picture of the country, I mean, Michael, I'm a stats nerd. I love this stuff. And I just think it provides an insight into New Zealand, and it tells us what's happened in the past and what's happening now. It's really, really interesting.
I
you and
agree with you.
Need to talk about fertility, because, man...
that was the next thing I was just about to come to. We are not breeding. Well, personally, I blame you, Paul. How many children have you got, mate? I've done my bit.
Two.
Well, there you go. You see? You're letting this die down. You should have had more than two, but no. Okay.
No.
I've got... Yes, okay, I won't go there. I won't go through the myriads, but I've done my bit on that. But who are the people in particular who aren't having children? Are there particular cultures, ethnicities, I don't know, educational groups? Who are they?
Generations. So as soon as we get to millennials and then Generation Z, we are seeing the rise of women who are not having children or are one and done. And, of course, they're having children much later in life. Yes, so they are having, most children are now born to women in their 30s in New Zealand, whereas if we go back to the 70s, you might remember, 60s, there was a moral panic around teenage pregnancies. Teenage pregnancies ain't a thing. There are more children, I don't know whether I said to you this previously, but there are 1,000 more children born to women aged 40 and over than to women aged 20 and under in 2023. So it's just extraordinary. And then what we've seen is over the last 5 to 7 years, this drop in fertility rate. When I say fertility rate, it's the number of children per woman. So it's now down at 1.52. In the last year, it dropped from almost 1.6 to 1.52. And you need 2.1 to replace your existing population. So what that tells us, in the last year, there weren't enough children to replace our existing population in New Zealand. And that's why immigration becomes super important. And there's a very good article in The Economist called Cash for Kids, which talks about the decline of fertility. And if you think 1.52 is low, 1.52 children per woman is low, go to Korea, it's below 1. Go to China, go to Taiwan, go to Portugal, go to Hungary. You just see this collapse of fertility, what's called the baby bust, the collapse of fertility. And so we're looking at a very, very different demographic future as we proceed through this century.
Have you come to some rudimentary ideas as to why this has been the case, Paul?
Yes. The two major reasons are the increasing educational credentials of women. So more and more of them are doing tertiary qualifications in a country like New Zealand. More and more of them are in the paid workforce. So here in 2024, it's exactly 50-50. 50% of the workforce are men, 50% are women.
Wow.
But the big issue that's come through in the last 5 to 7 years is the cost of having children and the cost of living. And so you're seeing an increasing trade-off. You know, can I afford a house and children? No, I can't. Do I need 2 incomes? Absolutely. And so, you know, there's a thing called the baby calculator that estimated that to bring a child up to the age of 18, sort of direct and indirect cost $285,000 in New Zealand. Children are increasingly expensive. So you're seeing that economic factor. The fourth would be environmental, but that's I think the economic one is increasingly the one where we're seeing play out in a country like New Zealand.